As a YouTube story editor, this hook is pure emotional dynamite. A woman labeled a boot camp failure for 13 years walks into her father's memorial in a black dress, only to be publicly stopped by a two-star Admiral. Then his phone rings. Seconds later, the room changes, the Admiral salutes, and every uniformed service member rises to their feet. In one moment, humiliation becomes reckoning, and nobody is ready for it.
My name is Elise Morrow. At my father's memorial service, a Navy SEAL admiral physically blocked me from the front row, reserved for military personnel. As my own mother looked on without a word, 13 years of a carefully crafted lie began to crumble. For all that time, my family believed I was a disgrace who had failed basic training. The truth is, I am a lieutenant commander in an intelligence agency whose name cannot be spoken. That day, I knew I had to take my story back. Have you ever been completely misunderstood by the people you love most? Share your story below. Before I continue, I would love to see where everyone is tuning in from today. And if you have ever had to defend your own reality against your family's narrative, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about silent strength. The next part might be hard to believe. I was raised in Virginia Beach, just a short walk from the ocean, in a house that smelled like salt air and my father's polished leather boots. He was Master Chief Oliver Morrow, a Navy SEAL for 30 years, and he was home less than he was away. Military families learn to operate on hope instead of schedules. It is the hope of hearing his footsteps again, and the faith that the man who wore those boots will always come home. My mother, Sandra, was the foundation that kept us all from collapsing. With Dad gone, she did everything: the school runs, the bills, the grocery trips on base, and keeping the family car from falling apart. She could host a neighborhood barbecue with a brilliant smile, hiding the fact she had not slept in 72 hours from worrying about her husband. She attended every school event alone. She figured out how to unclog sinks, patch walls, and sort through the complicated tax paperwork for service members. She had a quiet resilience that most people never noticed. I think carrying that load alone for so long is what made her so tough. When you are forced to be strong for decades, it stops being a choice. My brother Tyler is 4 years my senior. In high school, he was the football star on the homecoming court and loved by all his teachers. His confident personality made him instantly popular. He got a scholarship to Virginia Tech for construction management and then started his career in Richmond. Tyler was the family success, mostly because his life was so easy to explain. His career path was clear. He never missed a holiday, and he called our mom every Sunday. He was the child my mother could boast about, her proof of a job well done. And I was the one who just watched. I spent my childhood observing from the edges, taking in every detail. I was reading books far beyond my age and asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. When Dad came home, Tyler would launch himself into his arms, and they would immediately start a game of catch. My approach was different. I would just sit on the porch steps, waiting. When he got out of his car, I would search his face as he walked toward me. He would get down on one knee, put his hands on my shoulders, and say, "Elise, what's on your mind?" I would ask him about the places he had been, what the sea looked like when there was no moon, and if he was ever afraid. He never answered directly, but the look in his eyes told me my questions were what mattered to him. My father was not a man who showed his feelings. 30 years as a SEAL will do that to you. But in those quiet moments on our front walk, when I was asking him things no one else would, I saw it. It was a profound, unspoken pride. The kind of pride that lives in the space between words. I wanted to be like him, but not the version my brother admired. Not the guy grilling burgers, throwing a football, or trading stories with other SEALs. I wanted to be the man who could disappear for months and return a different person. The one who carried secrets he would never tell. The one whose internal clock woke him at 4 a.m. because he had forgotten what it felt like to truly rest. At 17, I did not understand the true cost of that kind of life. I only knew it was the most real thing about him, and I wanted that for myself. The summer I graduated from high school, I told him my intentions. We were in the garage, his sanctuary, with a truck engine in pieces all over the concrete floor. His forearms were covered in grease. I sat on an overturned bucket and said, "Dad, I am joining the Navy." He did not look up from his work. He finished tightening a bolt, put his wrench down, and wiped his hands with a dirty rag. He finally met my gaze and said, "The Navy will take every last thing you are willing to give it. Just make sure you know that," he said. I told him I understood. He just gave me one sharp nod. He did not smile, he did not argue, and he did not try to talk me out of it. He simply picked up his wrench and went back to work. For him, that was a blessing. My mother, however, cried for 2 straight days. She had wanted me to attend a university and have a normal life. Tyler said I was just trying to get attention. "You are not him," he said one night at dinner with a sneer. "You will never be a SEAL." I did not bother to answer him. I enlisted a week after graduation, and in August of 2013, I arrived at Recruit Training Command. I was 18 years old, 132 pounds, and had never been more certain of anything. Boot camp was as difficult as everyone said it would be, and sometimes in ways you did not expect. Sleep was a gift. The instructors were always screaming, and the physical training was so grueling that guys much bigger than me were quitting in the first week. But for me, it was perfect. The strict routine, the discipline, and the profound sense of mission felt right. I was ranked number 1 in my division in running and swimming, and I was second in push-ups, losing only to a woman from Oklahoma who outweighed me by at least 40 pounds. Academically, I was in the top 3. After 2 weeks, my commander, Chief Petty Officer Brennan, pulled me aside. He told me I had a particular quality he rarely saw. He never explained what that quality was. He just said, "Keep your head down and keep up the good work." 3 weeks later, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I was woken up by 2 men in civilian clothes. They wore no uniforms or name tags and carried a folder that had my name on it. They said I had been chosen for a different assignment and that I had to leave with them right now. They offered no explanation, and it was not a choice. My drill instructor was informed I had a medical issue. The other recruits were told I had given up. My permanent record states, "Administrative separation for failure to adapt." My family was told, simply, that I had quit. They brought me to a phone in a stark white hallway with flickering lights overhead. One of the men stood about 6 feet from me, just watching with his arms crossed. I called my parents' house. My mother picked up on the second ring. I told her I was on my way home. I can still count the 3 seconds of dead air that passed before she replied, "Your father is going to be so disappointed in you." I wanted so badly to explain the truth that I was not a failure but had been selected, that my test results were in the top 1% nationally, and the Office of Naval Intelligence had recruited me for a top-secret program. I wanted to shout that this was more important than boot camp, more important than the SEALs, more important than she could imagine. But as I started to speak, the man against the wall just slowly and firmly shook his head. No, that was all it took. "I know, Mom. I am sorry," I whispered, then ended the call. That one phone call severed my relationship with my family for the next 13 years. The lie that I had quit the Navy became their absolute truth. It colored everything they ever thought about me. At Thanksgiving, my mother would let out a heavy sigh and say, "Elise could not even handle basic training." If a neighbor asked about me, she would say the military was not a good fit for her. And Tyler? He made my failure his favorite punchline. "My sister lasted 3 weeks in the Navy," he would say, trying to make his smirk look like sympathy. She could only handle 3 weeks. Over the years, that lie became my entire identity to them. It was not just an event, it was who I was. I was the Morrow child who gave up, and my brother Tyler was the one who succeeded. That was the official family version of the story, and I was not allowed to change it. But behind the cover of that lie, I was building a completely different life. The intelligence program I joined was unbelievably rigorous. After they pulled me from boot camp, I spent 14 weeks in training at a location that does not exist on any map, learning skills I can never mention. Within my first year, I was a certified intelligence specialist. I had a gift for languages. I learned Arabic in 6 months and Farsi in 8. I made Petty Officer Second Class in 2015 and was accepted into the Seaman to Admiral program. This was a unique Navy path for turning talented enlisted sailors into commissioned officers. I finished a 4-year degree in just 2 years at a Navy-partnered university while still doing intelligence work. I received my commission as an ensign in 2017. At 22, I was a naval officer, but my family just assumed I had a dull government job. For the next 2 years, my home was the USS Halsey, a destroyer based in San Diego, deploying to the West Pacific and Arabian Gulf. My role was leading the ship's intel team, where I gave our captain daily threat briefings that shaped our missions. A promotion to lieutenant junior grade came after 18 months. My career took a major turn in 2019 when I was assigned to the Joint Special Operations Command in North Carolina. This new assignment was where all my training came together. I started providing support for elite units, including the same SEAL teams my father once belonged to. My work guided incredibly sensitive operations. I watched rescues and raids happen in real time on screens from inside command centers, seeing things I can never talk about. In 2020, I was promoted to lieutenant. My duties sent me to unmentionable places for missions I am unable to detail. I saw images on screens at 3 a.m. that will stay with me forever. Yet each Thanksgiving, my mother would introduce me with the same line. Here is my daughter who gave the Navy a try, but it did not work out. I never said a word to change her mind. It was impossible. My cover was more important than anything, even if it made me the punchline of family jokes. My brother calling me a failure did not faze me. The data I worked with was top secret. Revealing the truth could have put people's lives at risk. Compromising a mission was not an option. So I endured the criticism at the holiday table year after year in silence. But one particular talk gave me the strength to handle it all. It took place on Thanksgiving of 2019. I was only home for 2 days between assignments. Relatives filled the house. My brother, Tyler, was there with his wife and kids. Aunts and uncles packed the dining room. My mother was in the kitchen, bragging about Tyler's new building contract. She hardly looked at me when I walked in, just noting, "Oh, Elise is home. Good." I slipped out to the garage later that evening to get some peace. I leaned on my father's workbench in the dark, the same place I stood when I told him I was joining up 6 years ago. The mess of old engine parts had been replaced with organized tools and a radio tuned to a country station. I could hear everyone laughing inside the house. The garage door opened with a creak, and my dad came in. He kept the lights off and just leaned on the far wall, crossing his arms. A minute passed in silence before he spoke quietly. I spent enough time in the teams to recognize a medical discharge. "That is not what happened to you." My eyes welled up with tears instantly. I could not form any words. I was not able to confirm or deny a thing. I just stood there in the shadows, trying to control my breathing. He gave me one slow nod, and that was all the validation I needed. He started to leave, but paused in the doorway. He did not turn to face me when he said, "I am proud of you, kid. Whatever it is you are doing." Then he went back inside. He never mentioned it again. He never defended me when my mother spoke. He never shut down Tyler's teasing. He valued my security clearance over my family reputation, understanding that some duties are more important than being seen. That was the last time we ever discussed my work. He carried my secret to his grave. Tyler's bitterness grew worse in 2020 and 2021. His own marriage ended. His wife took their daughter and moved away to Northern Virginia. Tyler was stuck with child support, a mostly empty apartment, and a failing business. His drinking increased, and he seemed to show up at family gatherings just to start an argument. He aimed all of his rage at me. To him, I represented everything he had failed to achieve. I had a nondescript government job, an ordinary car, and a small apartment. I came to holidays single, childless, and seemingly without any drive. He called me the family freeloader behind my back. He would say it to our mom and our cousins, to anyone who would listen. My mother never corrected him. In her mind, he was simply stating a fact. The Thanksgiving dinner in 2021 is one I will never forget. I had just finished a 72-hour shift at a command center. We were managing a hostage rescue mission in West Africa. My team worked non-stop to locate 3 captured Americans. We found them, the team went in, and we brought all 3 home safely. I drove straight from the base, changing in my car and grabbing a pie from the store on the way. Tyler was seated at the table when I arrived. He glanced at me, then at the pie, and smirked. It must be great getting paid by the government to do nothing. My mother laughed a little. It was not a mean laugh, just the sound of someone who has accepted a lie for so long they forget it can be hurtful. I took my seat and ate, putting on a smile until I could leave at 9. On the dark drive home, her laugh replayed in my mind. I got home and just sat in my car in the driveway. My apartment lights were on, but I felt like I was on the outside looking in, the same way I felt at my mother's. I felt like a stranger to myself. I had just helped save 3 lives, but all I could remember from the holiday was my brother's jab and my mother's endorsement of it. That night, I began to question if maintaining my cover was worth the emotional cost. In 2021, I was chosen for a secret intelligence unit that answered only to the Director of National Intelligence. The secrecy was at the highest level imaginable. I became a lieutenant commander, leading a targeting group for top-tier missions. This was the most important work I had ever done, with the most elite people in my field. The security around my transfer was so tight that even my old commanding officer knew nothing until the orders were official. I was just 26 years old. I had one of the highest security clearances the military could grant, and my own family thought I answered phones for a living. Then, in 2023, my father's health began to fail. At 57, he was still in the service and nearing his mandatory 30-year retirement. He had been planning things for months, like a fishing trip with his old team friends, but he just did not have the strength. Sandra noticed first. He was sleeping too much and barely eating. Doctors at the Navy hospital ran tests in October. The news in November was crushing. He had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and it was too far along to treat effectively. The doctors said he had maybe 6 to 12 months. My father heard the news with complete calm. Then he told the doctor, "That is longer than some of the guys I knew ever got." Sandra just fell apart. Tyler came down from Richmond for a full week. As soon as I heard, I put in for emergency leave. My request was turned down. I was involved in a mission that could not be stopped. Targeting operations were active, and lives were on the line. My director was sorry, but said the mission had to continue. I was not there when he got the diagnosis. I was not there for his first treatments. I missed 3 family get-togethers. After a while, Sandra no longer called me with news. I received one text message from my brother, Tyler. It just said, "Thanks for not showing up again." I stared at my phone for a solid 10 minutes. Then I set its screen down and got back to work. The worst part was that he was right. I had not been there. It was not the choice I wanted. I would have done anything to be with my father. But my job is to protect people who will never know my name. If I took even 1 week off, people could die. My dad would have understood that calculation. He lived it for 30 years. My brother and sister could never grasp it, and I was not allowed to explain. So I took their anger, just like I took everything else, in silence and all alone. My father passed away on January 14th, 2025, at the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth. My dad was just 58 years old. He gave 30 years and 4 months of his life to the United States Navy. He earned a Bronze Star for his bravery, 2 Purple Hearts, and the unwavering trust of his teammates. I got there 6 hours after he was gone, flying in from a location I cannot name. I am forbidden from ever saying where I was or what I was doing. The moment we landed in Norfolk, I turned on my phone. The screen showed 17 missed calls. I did not need to listen to the voicemails. I knew what they would say. I drove directly to the hospital. The halls smelled of cleaning supplies and old coffee. I found my mother standing by herself, just outside his room. I had never seen that look on her face before. Her expression was beyond anger, settling into a look of complete and utter weariness. She said nothing at all. She simply turned on her heel, retreated into my father's room, and gently shut the door. For the next 11 minutes, I was alone in that hallway. To keep my mind busy, I counted the 47 tiles on the ceiling. A nurse passed by my position twice. The hospital chaplain asked if I wanted company. I told him no, thank you. When the door finally opened again, my brother Tyler emerged. He looked right at me and said only, "You were too late." He walked past without another glance and headed for the elevators. I went inside. My father appeared peaceful, smaller than I recalled, but finally at rest. His hands were crossed over his chest. His seal trident pin was resting on the nightstand. I took a seat in the chair next to his bed and did not move for 2 hours. No tears would come. I took his hand and told him everything that should have been said years before. I confirmed that I was still serving. I described my command, my intelligence team, and the directorate I worked for. I talked about missions I helped orchestrate and the people I helped bring home. I shared all the classified details that regulations had kept me from telling him. Then I apologized. Not for my job, but for every missed holiday, every ignored call, and each time the mission had to be my priority. Though he was gone, I felt he understood. His service was set for July, a full 6 months away. The ceremony was scheduled for the chapel at Naval Station Norfolk, with full military honors. It was a tribute my father had earned many times over. His 30-year career as a Navy SEAL was marked by numerous combat tours and enough medals to fill a display case. He built a reputation that made young SEALs stand taller when they heard his name. The chapel was going to be at capacity. It would be filled with SEALs in their dress uniforms and officers from every branch of special operations. Our family and friends would sit in the pews just behind them. I drove to the base by myself that Saturday morning. The sky over Virginia was a solid, oppressive gray, like a heavy quilt on the world. I wore a plain black dress, with no jewelry except for the watch I had taken from my father's room. I had purposely decided against wearing my uniform. I wanted no sign of rank. The decision was deliberate. This day was about him. I was not there as Lieutenant Commander Morrow, but as Oliver's daughter. By the time I arrived, the chapel was already nearly full. I spotted Sandra and Tyler in the front row, with relatives I had not seen for a decade. My Uncle Ray was there, along with Aunt Patricia. Tyler's former wife was absent, but their daughter, Lily, was on Sandra's lap. Behind them, the pews were a sea of white uniforms and gold insignia. I saw faces I knew, operators I had supported with intelligence, commanders I had briefed, and men who executed missions my team had developed. No one there recognized me. To them, I was just another anonymous woman in mourning. At the front of the room, Rear Admiral James McEwen, a Navy 2-star, stood near the podium. For the final 10 years of my father's career, he had been his commanding officer. McEwen was the one who had promoted my dad, approved his last tour, and visited him in the hospital 3 times. The Admiral was the very image of a naval officer, imposing, confident, with a presence that owned any room. He was officiating the service. I started my walk down the main aisle. My heels echoed in the hushed space. Sandra noticed me immediately. Her posture went rigid and her expression became ice. She approached Admiral McEwen, who was greeting some guests near the front. I saw her speaking with him, but from 20 feet away I was unable to hear her words. I would later learn exactly what she told him. She said, "That is my daughter. She isn't in the military. She failed to complete basic training." The Admiral responded with a short, decisive nod. It was the gesture of an officer who has just received information and made a quick judgment. He then turned from my mother and moved to intercept me. He was at least 6'2", with an air of absolute authority. He placed a hand on my upper arm. It was not a comforting touch, but a firm, controlling grip meant to remove someone from a restricted space. The pressure was so strong I could feel each of his fingers digging into my arm. He looked down at me from his significant height. At 5'6", I was giving up a good 8 inches to him. His voice was projected for the first 3 rows to hear. "Ma'am, please step back. This section is reserved for service members." A wave of silence washed over the chapel. It started at the front and rolled steadily toward the back. Within moments, every single person was looking our way. The entire assembly watched as an admiral gripped a woman's arm, seemingly to escort her away from the front of her father's memorial. My brother Tyler studied the floor. My mother sat perfectly still, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, uttering nothing. She was completely quiet. She offered no correction. "No, she is my daughter. And no, you have made a mistake." Not a sound. She was the person who told the lie. She had created this situation, and now she just sat and watched. I did not pull away. I caused no scene. The thought of saying, "I am a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy," never crossed my mind. I simply turned and walked back up the aisle. My heels made the same sharp sound on the tile. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. The SEALs, the officers, and my own relatives watched as I was removed from my father's service. I kept my chin up and my eyes forward. My breathing was slow, calm, and measured. I did what my training had taught me over 13 years. I absorbed the injustice. At that moment, McEwen's phone buzzed. He retrieved it from his uniform jacket and glanced at the screen. I had managed about 5 more steps toward the rear doors. He took the call. Though I could not hear what was said, I saw the impact it had on him. I had glanced back over my shoulder and witnessed the change. The color drained from his face in an instant, as if a switch had been flipped. His entire posture changed. His confident shoulders, held high just 3 seconds before, seemed to collapse and then tense with stress. His other hand, the one that had held me, fell limply by his side. He spoke only 2 words into the receiver. "Yes, sir." After a short pause, he said, "I understand, sir." He then disconnected the call. The person on the phone was Captain William Driscoll, the commanding officer of Naval Station Norfolk. He had been observing the chapel's security cameras from his office, a routine procedure for high-profile services. He had witnessed McEwen grab me. He had seen my mother point me out, and he knew precisely who I was. My intelligence unit had provided a security brief to his command only 6 months prior. Captain Driscoll must have been direct. He informed the Admiral of his error and gave him an explicit order to correct it immediately. I was now about halfway up the aisle, my pace even, my face showing no emotion. A heavy silence filled the chapel. It was like 200 people had forgotten to breathe. Lieutenant Commander Morrow. I stopped in my tracks. My hand found the polished wood of a pew, I think in the 8th row. I did not turn around right away. I let 2 full seconds pass, my hand resting on the pew, letting the quiet intensify. Then I turned slowly. Every eye in the room was on me. 200 people, my father's colleagues, his commanders, his team, and his family, all stared at the woman who had just been dismissed. Admiral McEwen approached me. His footsteps echoed with the same authority, but they were now much slower. The Admiral stood before me and his body snapped to attention. He assumed a formal military bearing. With his shoulders squared and chin high, he looked me directly in the eye. Then, his hand rose in a crisp salute. His voice had a slight tremor as he spoke. "Ma'am, my apologies. That front pew belongs to you." I raised my own hand and returned the salute. I held it for a perfect 3 count, just as they teach you, just as my father would have done. I lowered my arm, but said nothing. Any words would have broken the power of the moment. I turned and walked toward the front of the chapel. As I did, every uniformed officer in the room began to rise to their feet. It began in the 2nd row, with a commander whose silver oak leaf insignia I saw as he stood. The row of officers in front of me rose, followed by the next. The motion continued, one row after another. By the time I walked to the front, every uniformed officer in the church was standing. It was like a ripple in a quiet lake, spreading out from the middle of the room. My mother's jaw had dropped. Her hands, once folded, were now gripping the pew ahead of her. My brother, Tyler, looked right at me, not at the ground. It felt as if he was truly seeing me for the very first time. I might have looked like his sister, but he was staring at a total stranger. I sat down, only 2 seats away from Sandra. A profound silence filled the air. As everyone remained standing, a strange sense of peace came over me. For the first time in 13 years, I did not need to explain myself. The service for my father, Oliver, continued. Admiral McEwen went back to the podium. He spoke about Dad's 30 years of service, his command of the teams, the men he mentored, and the operations he commanded. His voice was firm, yet his hands trembled slightly on the lectern. He never said my name again in his speech. He did not have to. Every single person there knew exactly what had just occurred. After the service, people gave me handshakes and respectful nods. I heard quiet voices say, "Ma'am," and "My condolences, Commander." Then, a senior chief petty officer came up to me. He was a large, formidable man, his uniform adorned with a seal trident and countless service ribbons. "Your father spoke of you," he said. He was vague on the details, but he was incredibly proud. I nodded slightly and thanked him, keeping my composure until he was gone. Across the chapel, Sandra was staring. She had been frozen by the entrance for 20 minutes with Tyler and Aunt Patricia. Her face showed pure shock, like her entire world had just been upended. Tyler started towards me 2 times, but after only 3 steps, he turned back to his mother. I skipped the reception. It was at Sandra's home, with catered food, lawn chairs, and a slideshow of my dad's life on a laptop. I just could not make myself go. It was not really anger that stopped me. The feeling was much deeper, something I had no word for. I went home to my apartment in Norfolk, left my car in the garage, and rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. Inside, I just sat on the floor of my living room. I sat there for 2 hours in total darkness. I did not turn on a light, eat any food, or cry. I simply leaned against my couch, looked into the void, and felt the pressure of 13 long years settle over me. The day's events played over and over in my mind. McEwen's hand on my arm, my mother's shocked face, the look in Tyler's eyes, the phone call, the perfect salute, and the entire chapel getting to their feet. I thought about my father. He carried that secret quietly because his mission mattered more than his name. I was not angry or relieved. I just felt a void, a hollowness I had not felt since his death. It was as if a pillar I had been leaning on for 13 years had finally crumbled. 3 days later, I made a call to Captain Grace Tanaka. She was the senior intelligence officer who saw my potential and brought me into her world right after basic training. I remembered seeing her once in a corridor as I called my mother from a payphone. I was about to reveal everything, but she gave me a slight shake of her head. From that day on, she took me under her wing. Grace was the one who got me into JSOC and advocated for my transfer to the Intelligence Directorate. She practically shaped my entire career path. She was also the closest thing to a mother I had who actually knew my world. I explained everything that had taken place at the funeral. I described McEwen's gesture, the call, the salute, Sandra's face, and Tyler's reaction. She heard the whole thing without saying a word. When I finished, there was a heavy silence for about 10 or 15 seconds. "Elise, you did the right thing," she finally said. "That story was necessary. It kept operations secure, and it saved lives. Not just here, but in places your family has never heard of, for people they will never know. Your father knew that. It meant everything to him." Then a question I had not planned to ask slipped out. "Did my dad ever try to contact you?" I needed an answer from someone who was not family. Grace was quiet for a moment. "One time, about 4 years ago, he somehow got the main number for my office, which is not easy to do. He left a message. He said, This is for Captain Tanaka. I do not know what my daughter does, but I know it is significant. I wanted someone in her command to know her father is proud of her. And that was it. He disconnected before I had a chance to reply. After my call with Grace ended, I just sat there. I stayed on my bed, phone resting in my lap, letting her words sink in. My father had called her. He went to all that trouble to find her, just to say he was proud. He was not digging for information or trying to uncover secrets. He just needed someone I worked for to know that he saw the importance of my job. All this time, I had worried he was embarrassed by me. I thought he secretly believed all the awful things Sandra used to say to me. His quietness was not disappointment. I had been wrong all along. It was pride. He had been proud of me for years. He just was not able to tell the people who mattered most. It was not a choice he made lightly. He knew that certain secrets must be kept. He knew the burden of that silence is hardest on the ones you love. Back at Sandra's house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Tyler was walking back and forth in the living room, shaken by the events at the church. He was restless, and his voice trembled. He could not stop thinking about the Admiral's hand on my arm, the phone call, and me saying, "Yes, sir." He pictured the salute and the 200 officers on their feet, for the very woman his mother had labeled a failure. Sandra was at the kitchen table, where she had been sitting since returning from the memorial. Behind her, the catered dishes remained untouched. In the other room, the slideshow of Oliver's life continued, showing pictures of him in his uniform overseas and with his men. She heard the soft click of each new photo, but her eyes were fixed on empty space. Tyler paused in the doorway to the kitchen. "How?" was the only word he could manage. How can a person who supposedly washed out of basic training earn a salute from a 2-star admiral? I need an answer. Sandra did not raise her head. Her hands were pressed flat on the table, her fingers spread out. "I do not know," she answered. Tyler would not let it go. So she was lying to us for 13 years? At last, Sandra looked up at him. Her eyes were swollen, but had no more tears. She was calm now. She said softly, "Or maybe we were the ones who were mistaken for 13 years. I did not hear from them again right away, and I was not surprised. The service had shattered the narrative our family had held onto for more than a decade. They were only beginning to pick up the broken pieces. I got it. I had 13 years to live with the reality. They had only been given 90 minutes. Over the next 2 days, Sandra tried calling me 3 different times. I watched the screen light up but let it go. It was not because I was mad. I just could not summon the strength to explain 13 years of a classified career over the phone, especially not to her, in the same kitchen where she had called me a disgrace. I replied with one short text. "I am fine. I just need space." Tyler later told me she looked at that text for an entire hour. Then, my brother did something I never would have predicted. 5 days after the funeral, he went to Naval Station Norfolk. He left his car in the visitor parking area, entered the public affairs office, and informed the sailor at the desk that he was Elise Morrow's brother and was hoping to understand her role in the Navy. The petty officer, a young woman around 23 years old, looked him over before she reached for the phone. Tyler just stood there. He later said he waited at the counter for almost 10 minutes, feeling more and more like an idiot while she whispered into the phone. Suddenly, a door nearby opened, and 2 men in regular clothes emerged. They were courteous and professional, as they presented their credentials from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They calmly informed him that information regarding personnel with classified duties was not public, and that his inquiry was now on record. After that, they walked him off the naval base. Standing in the parking lot, Tyler called Sandra, his voice unsteady. "Mom, they just walked me off the base. 2 agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. And it was all because I asked a question about my own sister." Sandra paused for a second. Tyler continued, "What sort of trouble has she gotten into? What is her actual job?" Sandra finally said, "I have no idea, but it's obviously far more serious than we ever imagined." Tyler did not know it at the time, but his trip to the base told him more than words ever could. Federal agents do not remove a person from a secure military installation simply for inquiring about a clerk. That level of reaction only occurs when the individual you ask about is involved in work so secret that the job title itself is classified. The next week, I had a meeting with Grace Tanaka. Her office was a small, windowless space on the third floor of a building that you will not find on any public record. I let her know that I could not continue living the deception. I was not talking about the official cover story. I would never put an operation or my team in danger. But I was done letting my family's mistaken perception of me define who I was. I was tired of enduring holiday dinners, listening to their jokes about how I was a failure. I would no longer be the family's running joke. Grace was completely understanding. She had seen this happen before with intelligence personnel whose fabricated identities started to eclipse their real lives. She told me the Navy would not be declassifying my work. The details of my position, the directorate, the targeting unit, and my missions would all be kept secret. However, there were a few things I was now permitted to reveal. My real rank, my commission as an officer, my continuous years of service, and the fact that I was a naval officer. I enlisted in the Navy at 18, and in reality, I never left. The specific details had to remain classified. But the greater truth, the one my family had misunderstood for 13 long years, was something I could finally share. I made up my mind to tell them, but I would do it on my own terms and on my own schedule. It was not going to be because the memorial service had put me in a corner, or because Sandra and Tyler were pushing for information. It would happen because I had earned the right to be recognized for the person I actually was. That evening, I went to my closet. My dress white uniform was hanging in the back, perfectly ironed and spotless, still covered in plastic from a classified briefing 7 months ago. It featured 2.5 gold stripes on each sleeve, which signifies the rank of a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. My family had never seen me wear this uniform, not once in 13 years. I traced my fingers over the sleeve, sensing the significance of what those stripes stood for. It was all the training, the deployments, the operations, and the personal sacrifices. It represented every phone call I did not answer, every holiday I was unable to attend, and every family meal I sat through without saying a word. I left the uniform inside its protective bag, but kept the closet door slightly open. 3 weeks after the memorial, I could sense a change in the atmosphere, even from far away. Sandra was starting to come apart, not in a loud or theatrical way, but in the subtle manner people do when a deeply held conviction is broken. She began to reconsider years of her own remarks. Every Thanksgiving she had announced that I just wasn't able to come. She remembered every talk with a neighbor where she dismissed me, saying, "Well, she at least tried the military. It just was not the right fit for her." It was every moment she proudly showed off Tyler's newest building project, and then looked over at me with an expression of both pity and disappointment. She took out old photo albums from a closet in the spare room. She laid them out on the dining room table, looking at each one carefully. Thanksgiving 2014, Christmas 2016, the 4th of July 2018, and she finally saw what was always there, my calm demeanor, the cautious way I would respond to questions about my job, detailed enough to seem ordinary but unclear enough to give nothing away, how I would deflect questions instead of just denying them. It was the controlled composure of a person trained to protect secrets in a space full of probing questions. That discipline had been there the entire time, in every photo, at every holiday gathering, and during every single conversation. She just had not bothered to see it. She called her friend Deborah, who had been a Navy wife for 40 years and whose husband retired with the rank of captain. Deborah had experienced a lot during her life as a military spouse. She knew about the world that Sandra was just starting to learn about. Sandra explained everything to her. The memorial, McIvans, the phone call, the salute, and the officers who stood so formally. Deborah listened quietly. Then she spoke. Sandra, people in those kinds of programs are not allowed to tell you a thing. That is the entire purpose. The cover story is not a lie. It is for protection. Sandra answered, But it has been 13 years. Deborah interrupted her. She was not being dishonest with you. She was keeping you safe. There is a huge difference. And just because you do not understand that right now does not alter the facts. Sandra hung up and sat at her kitchen table with her hands clasped. A fresh understanding was starting to form in her mind, something that would take months for her to completely accept. Her daughter did not fail out of the Navy. She had gone much further into it than Sandra could have ever dreamed. And the quietness, all those years of silent holidays, was not a sign of failure. It was a sign of discipline. Tyler was also changing. His experience with the investigative agents had shaken him badly. For so long he had made fun of me, certain he was correct, and now that belief was completely shattered. He was sitting in his truck one evening in front of his apartment in Richmond, with the engine off and the windows rolled up. He reflected on every instance he had called me a freeloader, every holiday wisecrack he had made, and every time he rolled his eyes when I told him I could not discuss my work. He took out his phone and wrote 2 short words. I am sorry. He looked at the message for 5 whole minutes before he finally hit send. I was sitting at my desk when his text arrived. I looked at it, leaned back in my seat, and sent 2 words in reply. I know. Tyler stared at my response for quite a while. Just those 2 words. No punctuation, no emoji, nothing like it is okay or do not worry about it. Just, I know. I believe he was expecting to be forgiven. What he received instead was an acknowledgement. And I have a feeling he eventually realized that the acknowledgement was a far more genuine reply than forgiveness would have ever been. News began to travel through the Navy circles in Virginia Beach. Military installations are like small towns, and the SEAL community is an even closer-knit group. Oliver Merrow's old teammates, the men he had served with, trained alongside, and who had lifted him onto their shoulders at his retirement party, started to contact Sandra. They were not calling to criticize or shame her, but to give her some perspective. A retired senior chief by the name of Pete Garza came to her house one afternoon. Pete was 61, built like a small tank, with a grip that could likely crush stone. He had served with my father for 15 years, which included 3 deployments, 2 of which built a connection that endures forever. Sandra let him inside. She prepared some coffee. Pete took a seat at the kitchen table, the very same table where Sandra had been wrestling for weeks to understand her own daughter. He then told her a story that she had never heard before. He began, Oliver called me about 4 years ago, pretty late at night. He had been drinking, not heavily, but just enough to speak freely. He said to me, Pete, my little girl is involved in things I can't ever be told about, and I've never been prouder. I asked him what he meant. He simply replied, I can't tell you. I just had to say it to someone who would get it. And that is how the conversation ended. At that moment, Sandra completely fell apart. She started to weep in a way I am sure she had not since the day my father passed away. It was a profound, agonizing cry that originated from deep inside, from the area of a person that harbors the most significant regrets. She had just found out from someone who knew her husband for 15 years that Oliver had been aware of the situation the whole time. He was aware that I had not failed. He was aware that I was involved in something very important, and he hid it from her, not due to a lack of trust, but because his dedication to that world was unconditional. That night, Sandra sat by herself, holding Oliver's trident pin. She rolled it between her fingers, tracing the outlines of the eagle, the trident, the anchor, and the pistol. It was the symbol that represented her husband, and she finally realized that her husband and her daughter were members of a world she could never enter. I received a text from Sandra on a Saturday morning near the end of August. It was straightforward and to the point. The Lighthouse Diner, Saturday. Just the 2 of us, please. That diner was a small place on Shore Drive, where my father would take Tyler and me after church on Sundays when we were little. I could still picture the sticky vinyl seats, the laminated menus, and a server named June. She called everyone on and would top off your coffee before you even needed to ask. It had been many years since I had been inside that diner. I looked at her text for an entire day before I answered. I had no idea what the purpose of this meeting was. Was it going to be an ambush, a peace offering, a confrontation, or a lecture? On Sunday morning, I just wrote back okay and sent it, not allowing myself time to change my mind. On Saturday, I made the drive. I pulled into the gravel lot behind the diner and sat in my car for 3 whole minutes, staring at the entrance. I ran through about a dozen different opening lines in my head. In some, I was cool and distant. In others, I finally let loose 13 years of things left unsaid, the kind of brutal truths that feel good to deliver but awful to receive. As it happened, I did not get to use any of my prepared speeches. Sandra was already in a booth when I went inside. She was clutching an old white coffee mug, its diner logo nearly worn away. Her eyes were puffy and red, not from crying just then, but from the deep, settled redness that comes after weeks of tears. She appeared smaller than I remembered, more brittle and older, burdened by an exhaustion that was more than just physical tiredness. It was the weariness that comes from clinging to a lie for years, only to finally let it go. She was the first to speak. She bypassed all the small talk I had expected, about my work, about McKeevan's, the salute, or the phone call. Instead, her words went straight to the heart of it all. For 13 years, she began, I told anyone who would listen that you were a failure, and you never said a word to correct me. I could only look at her. This was my mother, the very rock that held our family firm during my father's 30 years in the service, the woman who learned plumbing, home repairs, and our budget. The same woman who had turned that strength on me like a weapon. I was not allowed to, was all I could say quietly. Her eyelids drifted shut and stayed that way for several seconds. When she looked at me again, she went on. Your father tried to tell me, not with his voice. He would just give me this certain glance whenever I said something about you, like I was missing some vital part of the story. He wanted to speak up, but he just could not, and I chose to ignore it every single time. I reached out my hand across the table to cover hers. Her skin felt cool from the mug. We sat in silence for a moment. The waitress, June, stopped by with more coffee, sized up the situation with 30 years of practice, and quietly moved on. Finally, Sandra asked, Is there anything you are able to tell me? So I told her what I was permitted to share. I told her that I was a lieutenant commander, an officer in the United States Navy. I explained that I had been serving continuously since I was 18, that I had never failed or quit. I described how my work was classified, which was the reason I could never offer any details. I emphasized that missing holidays and important calls was never a choice I made without regret. Every time I was unreachable, there was a compelling reason I could not disclose. She took it all in, her head nodding slowly. Then she asked the only question that truly mattered. Are you safe? I had to think for a moment. My head filled with flashes of command rooms, computer monitors glowing at 3 a.m., and missions in dangerous places. Most of the time, was my honest reply. Sandra let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the type that escapes without warning, a sound mixed with both relief and pain. It was the exact same laugh my father had. We both recognized it but let the moment pass. She did not need to know all the specifics. She just needed enough of the truth to undo the false image of me she had carried for so long. And for the first time in 13 years, I was allowed to give that to her. We left the diner together, walking side by side. Out in the lot, the Virginia Beach sun was bright, reflecting off the cars. As we stood next to my car, Sandra did something I had not seen her do since I was a little girl. She linked her arm with mine. It was not a full hug, but a much more comfortable and natural gesture, as if it was something she did every day. She held it there for a little while before walking over to her own car. I slipped into my driver's seat and watched as she drove away. The air smelled of gravel dust, salt from the sea, and diner coffee. A feeling I had not known for years washed over me. It was not forgiveness, nor was it relief. It was a more peaceful feeling, like a new chapter was about to begin. 6 months after our meeting, our relationship was transformed. It was not fixed, but it was different. Sandra and I began having phone calls every week. In the beginning, our talks were short, mostly touching on the weather or what she was making for dinner. But slowly, they started to last longer. She would ask about my apartment, my meals, and the small details of my life. She never once pressed me for information about my work, a kindness that was more meaningful than she could ever realize. Tyler even came to apologize in person. He drove down from Richmond one weekend and found me at Sandra's place. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "I have been a terrible brother. I do not know how to fix it, but I want to start now." I told him that was all I ever wanted. Then he gave me a hug for the first time in over 5 years. The embrace was awkward and a bit too tight, and it lasted just a little too long, but it felt completely perfect. That Thanksgiving, in 2025, was the first holiday in 3 years where my career was not the family joke. When a cousin asked me what I did for a living, Tyler stepped in. "She cannot talk about it," he stated. His voice was serious, with no hint of sarcasm or ridicule. It was filled with a real respect that I had never felt from him before. And Sandra, when she introduced me to her new neighbor, simply said, "This is my daughter, Elise. She serves in the Navy." There were no qualifiers or apologies, just a plain statement of pride. I had waited 13 years to hear those words. That January, I was given a new assignment overseas. It was a critical step in my career, a 2-year deployment to lead operations from a secret location. The mission would be more challenging than anything I had done before, but I was ready for it. I called Sandra to share the news, and she was silent for a good 15 seconds on the other end of the line. I could only hear her breathing. Then, her voice soft, she said, "Come home when you can. I will leave the light on." My throat closed up, and I gripped the phone tighter. Those were the very words our father, Oliver, always used. Before each of his deployments, he would stand with Sandra in the driveway and tell her, "I will be home when I can. Leave the light on." In all 13 years, she had never said that phrase to me. It had always belonged to him. But now, she was giving his promise to me, in her own voice. "I will, Mom," I replied, and I meant it. The night before I was set to depart, I decided it was time to open the note that had arrived with my father's effects. The Navy had delivered a box in January containing his trident pin, a neatly folded flag, and a single piece of paper with his familiar block lettering. In the 7 months since his passing, I had relocated that box twice. I had even opened it on 3 separate occasions, but only to look at the items inside, never to read the letter. I just had not been ready to face it. But this night felt different. I sat on the bed in my bare apartment, my luggage packed and my alarm set for 0400. I gently unfolded the page. It was torn from a yellow legal pad, his handwriting made shaky by his last round of medication. He had written the date December 27th, 2024, just 3 weeks before he passed away. The note began, "Elise, I never told your mother the truth. That failure is on me, not you. I should have defended you. I should have been the one to speak up every time she made a comment. But I did not, and for that, I am deeply sorry. You are my most important legacy, Elise. Not Tyler, not my own service, but you. I love you, kid, Dad." I read his message once, then again, before pressing the letter to my chest and closing my eyes. I remained that way until my alarm clock sounded. I do not think I slept at all. I tucked the folded note into my uniform, zipped my bags, and turned off the lamp. In the dark before dawn, I drove to the airbase. That was a year ago. Today, I am serving overseas, completely absorbed in the work I was meant to do. The pace of the job is intense, with 16-hour days and meetings that begin before sunrise. The decisions I make have consequences I will never be able to talk about. and I excel at it. Here, my colleagues know me for my work and my position. They say my name with respect. I do not need to hide behind a cover story or act like I am less than what I am. In my work, I can finally be my whole self. Every Sunday, Sandra and I have a video call. She asks me about the weather and if I am getting enough sleep. She knows not to ask about my duties. Instead, she gives me updates on her garden. She chose to plant tomatoes this year, which she has not done since my father died. She tells me about my niece's softball team and the new neighbors who moved in. These are the small, normal updates she used to share only with Tyler, thinking I would not be interested, but I always was. Sandra has also started volunteering at the Fleet and Family Support Center. She now helps other Navy spouses get through deployments and the loneliness that can come with them. She told me about comforting a crying 23-year-old woman whose husband had just deployed for the first time. Sandra held the young wife's hand and told her, "Be proud of them, especially when you can't understand what it is they do." Today, she wears a new picture of me on her volunteer ID. In the photo, I am standing in front of a building she will never be able to name, wearing the uniform she now sees with respect. Tyler now sends me handwritten letters. He fills them with stories about his life, like how his daughter Lily is doing at shortstop. He tells me about a new construction project starting in Chesterfield County. His letters are no longer filled with apologies. We are both past that now. My brother and I are finally connecting, and I feel like I have a real sibling. The end of his last letter hit me hard. He wrote, "I told Lily all about you. I explained that her aunt has a very secret, very important job for our country. She asked me if you were a superhero. I told her you were. Reading that in my room at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night brought a smile to my face. My eyes started to burn. It was probably the kindest thing he had ever written to me. When my shift ended tonight, I walked out into the warm, thick air that feels like it clings to your skin. Have you ever felt completely misunderstood by your own family? For 13 years, they saw me as the one who failed, the one who could not get her life together. But they had no idea. I remember the day everything changed, standing in a chapel with a man named McEwen. His hand was on my arm, full of a condescending confidence that powerful men have. I recall my mom's silence, my brother Tyler's shoes, and then the phone call. In just 2 seconds, I watched every bit of arrogance drain right out of McEwen's face. He snapped to attention with a salute so sharp it could cut the air. The kind a man gives when he learns the woman he just dismissed outranks nearly everyone he knows. Then, slowly at first, the entire room of officers rose to their feet. My mother stared in total disbelief as her version of reality crumbled. I also remember Sandra at the diner, her hands cold on her coffee cup as she confessed, "I told people you did not make it." She said it flatly, without an apology. I remember Tyler's simple text, "I am sorry," and how I replied, "I know." Sometimes the shortest words have the most power. I recall one Thanksgiving when Sandra simply said, "She is in the Navy." Tyler immediately added, "And she cannot talk about it." That was the first time there were no jokes, no fake stories to fill the silence. I can still picture my dad in his garage, surrounded by scattered engine pieces. He told me, "The Navy will take every single thing you have." He could not have been more right. The cost was immense. I gave up holidays, family dinners, my good name, my mother's pride, and my brother's friendship. For 13 years, I was the failure at the family table. It demanded all of my will, but it also gave me something back. It gave me a purpose. It offered me a job that mattered. It placed me among peers who understood my work and respected my achievements. It gave me the certainty that my quiet, classified job, which my family could never imagine, saves lives. Real people get to go home to their families because my team made a vital decision at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. My father spent 30 years defending people he would never know. I followed in his footsteps for 13 years. The work was never the hard part. The hardest part was seeing my family genuinely believe that I had failed and having to endure their pity in silence. That was the one assignment I was never prepared for, It felt like a deployment with no return date, and it very nearly broke me. Things are better now. They have a small idea of what I do. They do not know the full story, of course. They have no concept of the missions, the objectives, the secret language, or the awful images from screens that are burned into my mind. But they finally know what counts. My mom knows I serve. My brother knows my work is important. And my dad, well, he knew the whole time. My hand rests on his letter. The paper is soft now, smoothed by countless nights. I clutched it when the job felt too heavy and home felt impossibly far away. You are the best of me. Just 5 words, written in a shaky script 3 weeks before my father passed away. Those 5 simple words spoke the truth that 13 years of being misunderstood had buried. I take a deep breath. The night is warm, and the stars seem to hang right above me. And I know, halfway around the world, my mom has left the porch light on for me. For the first time in a very long time, it feels like everything is going to be all right. If any of this feels familiar to you, if you have ever been the person in your family who is unseen, please hold on. The people who truly count will always see your real worth. You do not have to carry the burden of what other people think. If you like this story, please subscribe. I will see you all in the next video.